So to continue from where we left off in the last video, we took a look at an introduction to methods. We are now going to look at how to start passing arguments into these methods. So any value that is passed into a method, specifically when we're dealing with the method call, that's referred to as an argument. And then any variables that are specified in the method header that will hold these arguments are referred to as parameters. So there's kind of a key technical distinction between these. When you talk about the values in a method call, you refer to them as arguments, but when you refer to the variables in your method headers, you would refer to those as parameters. Admittedly, I will kind of use these interchangeably, but essentially anytime you're talking about something that is located in the parentheses and you're talking about a method, whether that's a method call or a method definition, talking about the header of the method, you can basically think of those as either arguments or parameters. So the arguments passed into a called method are going to then be paired with the parameter in the method definition, as long as we're maintaining that technical distinction between the two. So you can kind of think of it, if we use this example that we have right here, where we are trying to display a value. So the name of the method should be display value in both the call and the definition. We'll see this in a moment when we actually put this together. But essentially, the value 5 that we're passing into the method through the call, so the argument of 5, that's going to get paired up with the parameter that we can see int number, so that much is at least correct in the method definition, so that essentially that 5 is going to be the value that we assign to that parameter. So the comment that I showed just above the method call kind of shows that pairing where we're saying that we have our int number, the parameter, and then the 5, the argument, and how they're going to be associated with each other. So let's actually put this together. Come over here, and we're going to go ahead and continue to modify this method demo from the previous video. What I'm going to go ahead and do is just get rid of some of these extra calls to display message. We're going to go ahead and modify this a little bit. So let's go ahead and include that comment saying that int number will be equal to 5. We'll keep track of that as we go. So we're going to go ahead and have this call to display value, but before we can actually call it, we need to make sure that it actually exists. So we need to define it. So let's say after display message, we'll go ahead and create our display value method. So we're going to say public static void display value, and then we're going to go ahead and give it a parameter. So the parameter here is basically the equivalent of a variable declaration. We have to give it a data type and a name. So we're going to go ahead and use int as the data type, and we're going to use number as the name for it. And then when we get into the body, what we can go ahead and do is maybe just print out that number that we passed in. So we say system.out.println, and then we'll just put number right here. So then, of course, within this method, when we're using number, it's going to be whatever value we passed in. So if we go ahead and have our call right here, say display value, and we put this value of 5 right here. So what's going to happen is it's going to take this 5 right here, it will assign that to the parameter right here, and so then when we tell it to print it to the console, it's going to go ahead and print out the value that's currently assigned to it, which would be 5. So if we go ahead and run this, we can see two different print statements. The first one's for display message, hello from the display message method, and then the second one is going to be the value that we're printing out from display value, which is that value of 5. And then if you go ahead and do this, say maybe one more time with another value, let's say that now we want the number to have the value 10 assigned to it. So we'll just say display value, and we'll pass in the value 10 instead. And so then we'll take this value that we have right here, we'll go ahead and assign that to number right here, and then we'll go ahead and print that to the console right here. So keep in mind that for each one of these different calls that we make to this method, the value that we assign to number will be different for each of them. So you can kind of think of it like its own little bubble that's just associated with its own kind of data or its own bit of information that we're providing. And so if we go ahead and run this again, we'll see the value 10 for that second call to display value. Okay. So just like assigning a value to a variable, you must consider the data type compatibility between an argument and its corresponding parameter. So in the examples that I gave you, I made sure that the value that I was passing in, so the argument, was compatible with the data type of the parameter. So I made sure that the two values we used, 5 and 10, those were both int literals. So if I were to go ahead and modify this, so we go ahead and minimize this, and we do something like, say, 10.0, then it's immediately going to warn me about this. It'll give me a little error message. So if we hover over this, it'll say incompatible types. In this particular case, it's warning me about a possible lossy conversion from double to int. So if that sounds kind of familiar, it's because of the fact that what it's really trying to warn me about isn't just that there's an incompatibility between these two types, but that this incompatibility is going to result in a double 10.0 being assigned to an int, in this case number, and the possible loss of data that comes with that, because that is a narrowing conversion. So if I were to try to run this as it is right now, it'll tell me that there's going to be some errors with it. I'll try to run anyway, and then it'll give me this runtime exception. So it's primarily trying to warn me about the fact that I'm trying to do a narrowing conversion, and of course Java can't do this unless we force it to. So what we can go ahead and do, if we want to actually get this to go through, is just use a cast operator, say like so, and actually just force that value to be treated as an int instead. And so then if we go ahead and run this, it will go ahead and just give us that value 10 because it's able to successfully assign this value to number right here. So all of the same general rules that apply to our numbers when we're just looking at variables will also apply when we're dealing specifically with arguments and parameters. So all of the same rules about conversions still apply. So of course that means that Java will still automatically perform widening conversions. If I were to do the opposite, that would be totally fine. But if we want to perform a narrowing conversion, we must use that cast operator, like in the example that I just showed. So the next thing we'll go ahead and talk a little bit about deals with the scope of methods. So recall that declaring a variable within the initialization expression of a for loop, that requires declaring a variable that will only be used within the scope of that for loop. So that variable is only bound to the scope of that for loop. Similarly, the parameter variables are not going to be accessible outside of a method's scope. So you can think of the scope, as I kind of hinted at previously, like a little bubble that the variables are contained within. So if we consider show value that we have right now, the data type that we're using currently is an int. In this example, we're using it as a double. In either case, we've got this variable. So in this example, that variable is called value. So we can kind of think of the show value method as being like a little bubble that we can use value inside of. So maybe we want to take a look at that with our current example, dealing with display value using this variable name and number. So within the scope of this method, there is a variable called number. But as soon as we move back over to the main method, say right here, if we were to try to do something like, say, system.out.println, and we try to put number right here, and we save that, then we're going to get a little warning right here. And if we double check this, it's going to say cannot find symbol, and it's trying to tell us that it doesn't recognize number specifically within the scope of the main method. It doesn't know what we're talking about because number only exists within the scope of display value. Similarly, the other example that they use that is included right here, we have show message, and we've got a string called MSG, just short for message. And so, of course, in that case, we have the same situation where this variable MSG is contained within the scope or within that bubble of the show message method. So we can actually pass multiple arguments into a method. We don't have to limit it to just a single argument that we pass in. And then the order specified in the definition will also determine the order whenever we're calling the method. So in this example that we have right here, we're going to take two numbers, so in this case 5 and 10, and we're going to add them together. And in order to do that, that means we need to pass both of those numbers into this show sum method. So we can see that we've got two arguments, 5 and then a comma separation and then 10. So those are the two arguments. And then in the show sum method, so we've still got our public static void and then show sum. All of that's pretty standard. We've seen a little bit with our method definitions already, so we understand the method modifiers, that void return type, and the method name. The key thing that's going to be different now is that with our parameters, we're specifying 2 variables here instead of just 1. And just like with our arguments, it's going to use comma separation. So you've got int num1, that's going to be your first parameter. You'll then have your comma, and then you'll have int num2, that'll be your second parameter. And then, of course, when you get into the body of this showSum method, we'll go ahead and do a couple of different things. We'll declare and initialize this variable called sum. So it'd be an int variable that's just going to hold the sum when we add the 2 numbers together. We'll initialize it to 0, though. And then we'll go ahead and say sum is equal to num1 plus num2. And then finally, we'll go ahead and print out a little statement right here. We're using the printf method to do this. So essentially, it's just going to print out that the statement, the sum of, and then your 2 variables, and then the result at the end. So let's go ahead and put this together, and we'll take a look at everything. So we'll go ahead and minimize this, come over here, and we'll go ahead and create yet another method. So this next one, come down a little bit, we'll go ahead and create public static void. This will be display sum, and this is going to take 2 values. So we're going to have int num1, and then a comma, and then int num2. So those will be our 2 parameters for it. We'll then go ahead and create the body of this method. So we'll say int sum, we have to initialize that to 0. We'll say that sum is going to be equal to num1 plus num2. So we'll just assign the sum of those 2 numbers to it. And then finally, we'll go ahead and include that print statement. So we'll say system.out.printf, and we're going to say the sum of, and then this is going to be %d. So this will be the format specifier or placeholder for num1. And %d, this one will be for num2. Say is, another %d, that's going to end up being for sum, and then a period. And then at the end, we'll use %in to indicate the new line character. And so then when we start providing our argument list, the order that we want to do this in, we're going to do num1, comma, num2, comma, and then sum. Go ahead and save that. And so now this num1 right here, this is going to be associated with this first %d. Num2 is going to be associated with the second %d. And then sum is going to be associated with the third %d. So go ahead and save that. And then if we come back up to our main method, let's go ahead and get rid of this line right here since there's an error in it anyway. And let's go ahead and replace that with our display sum method. So we're going to make a call to that, and we're going to pass in the values 5 and 10. And then also go ahead and include another comment right above it so that we can again keep track of the different kinds of declarations and assignments. So for this one, we'll go ahead and say int num1. This is going to end up being equal to 5. And then we'll also say int num2. This one's going to end up being equal to 10. Okay. So then, when we come over to our method definition, we're going to pass in the values 5 and 10. So num1 will hold the value 5 inside of it. Num2 is going to hold the value 10 inside of it. We'll add those together, get 15. And then the order that we're going to print this in, because we specified num1 first in this formatted string, we'll say the sum of 5 and 10 is 15. So we go ahead and run that, and we can see that right here at the very end. The sum of 5 and 10 is 15. And of course, as I mentioned, order is going to matter. So if we were to rearrange the order of these, say we do 10 first. Come over here, place the cursor right here. I'll go ahead and replace this one with 10 and swap this one with 5. So now 10 is the first thing that we're passing in, so that's going to be associated with the first parameter, which was num1. So now num1 is going to be equal to 10, and then 5 is the second thing that we're passing in, so that's going to be associated with the second parameter. So now num2 is going to be equal to 5, and so then when we print this to the console, the order of these is going to be swapped. So now we're going to have 10 right here and then 5 right here. So if we go ahead and run this, then we're going to see the sum of 10 and 5 is 15. Okay. And another thing to note about the fact that this order matters, this becomes especially important when you're dealing with a method in which the parameters have different data types among them. So let's say, for example, we go ahead and change this so that num2, instead of being an int, is maybe a, let's say a double. So if we go ahead and do this, there's a couple of other things we'll have to change. Now that we're treating this as a double, this sum is expecting the result of num1 plus num2 to be a double. So to go ahead and account for that, we'll go ahead and change this to be a double. If we're doing a double for those, then that also means that the appropriate placeholders right here, their conversion character needs to be modified. So instead of doing %d, we would need to do %f for each one of these. Okay, so %d for num1 because that's still an int, and then %f for num2 since that's now a double, and %f for sum since we've changed sum to a double. And so then, if we come over here again, we have to keep in mind that, again, the order still matters, and so that also is associated with the data type. So num2 right here is now a double. So that means that num1 is still being treated as an int. So if I were to change num1 to a double, even though num2 is a double, num1 is not a double. So if I were to do this, I were to double check right here, again, it's going to say incompatible types, telling me that I have a possible lossy conversion from double to int. So I cannot make num1 a double without either accounting for the possible loss in that conversion, maybe with a cast operator. So in order to fix this, I've got to make sure that num1 is always treated as an int. Num2, on the other hand, could be a double. So I could do something like 5.5, and that would be totally fine. So if we go ahead and save this, we can run it like this, and we're going to do 10 plus 5.5. So go ahead and run that. And so then we'll see the sum of 10, and in this case, because I haven't specified anything for the formatting of it, it'll just do it to 6 decimal places. But essentially, the sum of 10 and 5.5 is 15.5. So again, we're keeping in mind that num1 is the first parameter. It will hold the first argument. Num2 is the second parameter. It will hold the second argument. So another thing to note is that arguments of primitive data types are going to be passed by value. The value stored at the location of the variable is passed from one method to another. Arguments of class types, say for example strings, are going to do what is known as passing by reference. This means that essentially, because of the fact that the thing that the variable holds is a reference to the object, so we've seen a little bit about this when we talked about the equals method for strings. Because of the fact that it holds that reference, that means that whatever memory address or essentially any way that it can reference the location of the object, that is going to be what is passed from one method to another. So for now, this distinction is negligible. When it comes to strings, the fact that they're passed by reference doesn't actually have any sort of noticeable impact on the usage of them. But when we get to the concept of classes and objects, when we expand upon that a little bit later, that distinction is going to become a little bit more meaningful. So to kind of briefly talk a little bit about this, essentially what I'm saying is that when we're dealing with primitive data types, say like this 10 and this 5.5 that I'm using, if I go ahead and modify this to maybe go ahead and use some kind of variable right here, say I have some double that I call, let's say just num, it's equal to 5.5, and I go ahead and place that right here. So go ahead and put num right here. So that means that this num, this variable that I'm using, is going to pass by value, meaning that essentially we can just replace num with the value that it holds, and that's what's going to be sent over to our method definition. So that's what's going to go over to the num2 that we have right here, and that's what we're going to assign to it, is that 5.5. Whereas if we're working with a string, it's important to keep in mind that we're going to be passing the reference to the string object. Essentially what that means is that while we're in the scope of this method, if we were dealing with a string, the parameter that we passed that reference into, that parameter would point to or reference the exact same object that the string, say maybe back in the main method where we called it, it would hold the same object reference as that variable there. And as I mentioned before, when we're dealing with strings, that the fact that that's occurring is pretty much negligible. It doesn't really impact them in any meaningful way. We'll talk more about this when we get into more advanced topics with classes and objects, and we'll see a little bit about this issue of passing by reference. We'll also see a little bit about this when we talk about arrays as well, since we'll talk a little bit about that next. So to finish up on dealing with arguments and parameters, we can go ahead and add a little bit more to the documentation comments that we've seen just briefly whenever we talk about the initial comments that are provided whenever we create a program in NetBeans. So documentation comments come with various annotation tags to more clearly describe code. One of these is going to be the @param annotation, which is used to specify the parameters of a method. So pretty clearly noted based on just the name of that annotation. It says param, which is just short for parameters. So if we go ahead and create a documentation comment for one of these methods, say we go ahead and do this for the showSum method, as soon as you start to create this in NetBeans, it will automatically start to populate it with all of the proper annotations, so all the proper tagging. So we can go ahead and actually do this and create something kind of like what we have right here. We're going to say kind of a general description, say like the showSum method displays the sum of two numbers, and then just kind of describe the two different parameters that we're working with. So we'll go ahead and minimize this, come over here, and we'll go ahead and do this with the display_sum method. So we'll go ahead and do a slash and then **. We push enter and we'll automatically populate it with the params right here. So we've got our two different annotations or two different tags for num1 and num2. The very first thing right here is going to be a general description about the method. So say the display_sum method is used to display the sum of two numbers. And then num1, we'll go ahead and say this is the first operand of addition. And we'll say this one is our second operand of addition. Okay. And then if we wanted to go ahead and take a quick look at this, so let's say we want to come over to our window, go over to our IDE tools, and open up our JavaDoc documentation. So we'll go ahead and take a quick look at this just to see what effect that has on our documentation. So I'm going to pull this up just a little bit. So we can see right here, whenever we place the cursor inside of this documentation comment, just anywhere inside of here, we can see the JavaDoc that comes with it. So it'll tell us a little bit about it. So it'll tell us the location of it. In this case, it's coming from the method demo package, referring to the package name here, the method demo class, referring to the class name right here or right here. We then have the header for it. So we've got public static void, display sum, int num1, double num2. It then gives us that general description that we just wrote right here. The display sum method is used to display the sum of two numbers. And then these two parameters that we provided, it'll actually create its own little section right here. So it'll say parameters, and then it'll have num1 and num2, this little dash, and then that definition that we provided right after that. Okay, so at this point, this will wrap up everything for passing arguments into methods. In the next video, we'll go ahead and take a look at kind of the other half of working with methods, where we'll talk a little bit about returning a value from our methods.